Do you ever feel like you're just doing this writing thing wrong? Like, no matter how hard you try, you just keep getting stuck or feeling frustrated? Well, the truth is, most writers don't get stuck because of a lack of talent. The reason you're probably getting stuck is because you've been trying to fit yourself into a writing process that doesn't actually work for the way your brain works or for your particular strengths. I am so excited for today's video because I feel like I could nerd out about this for hours and hours, but we're going to try to keep this succinct. And we're going to go over what I have identified as 9 different writing process archetypes. And we're going to go over what are the pros and cons of each one and how to figure out which one you belong to and then make the most of it so that you can stick with your writing projects, finish them, and find success as an author. So let's get going. So often in the writer world here on YouTube or in books or just people talking about their process, we hear about 3 different types. We hear about the people who are plotters and meticulously plan every scene. We hear about the people who are pantsers that just fly by the seat of their pants, just sit down with a rough idea and start writing. And then we hear about people that are somewhere in between. Well, there's actually a lot of different types of writing process, and I feel like they're not talked about enough. And sometimes when we don't hear or see an example of the type of writing process that we've naturally started to fall into, we can start to feel guilty or like we're doing it wrong or like we should be more efficient or we should try to be like somebody else. Well, today we're going to go over 9 specific archetypes of a writing process. And the truth is, you may be exactly one of these, or you are more likely to be some kind of combination or hybrid of all of them, which we'll get into towards the end of the video. The key is to think about, as I'm going through these, which resonates with you? What pieces of this have you not allowed yourself to experiment with in the past, or have you not allowed yourself to just go all in on? And that might be the one tip that is holding back your creativity this entire time. Also, there's going to be some processes that I don't even cover here today. So we can help each other by commenting below what your writing process is, especially if it's something completely different than what I mentioned here today. So this is not going to be the only definitive 9 writing processes that are out there. And I would love your feedback on what your process looks like. But the key is to give yourself permission to experiment until you find the process that works for you, instead of constantly forcing yourself or trying to force yourself into a process that you think you should have because you want to be a professional writer. Because I'm here to tell you that we all have our own unique blend of process. And so I'm going to give you some ideas of how to work with your own today. By the way, if you are new here, my name is Sarra Cannon. I have written and published 30 novels, and this month I will be celebrating the 15th anniversary since I first self-published my book, Beautiful Demons. So I am so excited for this month because we have Preptober going on all month. I have this video is on a playlist, so if you want to check all of those out. There's also free resources like a Preptober planner, and I did make a workbook for today as well. So if you are on my newsletter, you just got an email with that workbook inside the resource library. If you're not on my email list, go ahead and sign up, hit that subscribe button as well. You'll find all of those links down below in the description box. So we're just going to dive into these 9 archetypes, and you will find a link to a public view in Canva of these 9 archetypes and the slides that I'm sharing with you, just in case you want to go back over them or make notes for yourself. And then of course, there's a workbook that will help you to identify and work with your own particular writing style. The first writing style or archetype that I've identified is, of course, the plotter. The plotter loves outlines, character sheets, and scene planning, feels more comfortable with a solid roadmap usually before drafting. So if you have watched my videos in the past, you know this is often me. I love to have a lot of color-coded index cards, plotting. I like to think through the scenes ahead of time, and you will find a lot of videos here if you are a plotter, or if you want to use some of the techniques that plotters use, you will find a lot of stuff here on this channel. The advantages to being a plotter is that you have a clear structure. You often can avoid plot holes because you've already thought through everything before you start writing, and often it makes revisions easier and a lot more fun because when you're writing your draft, you already have a good idea of the story structure in mind. However, the cons here are that you can just get stuck in a planning loop forever. And with plotters, perfectionism often keeps them or us from starting. And sometimes, for if you're not truly a plotter, but you've been trying to force yourself to be a plotter, once you know the story, it's no longer interesting to you. It doesn't feel exciting. You're not excited to write it because you've already run through it all in your head. So if you find that to be true for yourself, maybe you're not actually a plotter and you might want to try some of these other writing techniques. So as we go through each of these different archetypes, I'm also going to give you some questions to ask yourself to discover, are you this archetype? So for the plotter, ask yourself, do you feel anxious if you don't know what's coming next in your story? Do you find joy in outlining spreadsheets, detailed character sheets before you draft? Is this something you find fun? When you don't have a roadmap, do you freeze or procrastinate? Do you feel like you really just need to know what's the end of this book? What's the midpoint of this book? You really enjoy story structure and you want to have that roadmap laid out before you even start writing, then you might be a plotter. I use this one first because I feel like so many authors feel that they have to be plotters because there's all these books out there about story structure. There's so many videos out there about story structure. And the truth is, you do not have to be a plotter to write an amazing novel. Some people are very intuitive as they're writing. Some people actually are better when they don't know ahead of time and they surprise themselves. So we're going to go over lots of different types of writing process. And I really encourage you to just open your mind as we go through these and let go of any feelings of like, oh, I should be this way. And instead, understand that there is no right or wrong process. There's only what works for you and what doesn't work. So, second archetype that we're going to talk about today is another process-based archetype or structure-based archetype that I call the scholar. So, the scholar is a research first writer. They love building deep, accurate worlds or histories. They really want to get in and understand the world and all of the street names and the maps and where everything is and how it fits together. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily writing a historical novel, but it might mean that you really dive into economy and how world building works and how the spell casting system goes. And you like to do your research ahead of time. Where this comes in handy is that you can have authentic detail, believable settings, just rich story depth and world depth. Where this becomes a con sometimes is that scholars can fall into an endless research loop where you are just stuck in the fun part and the part that feels easy to you, which is learning, 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 and input, input, input. And then you just delay the actual writing, which is fine for an extended period of time. You can take your time. There's no rule that says you have to get to writing as fast as possible or in anyone else's schedule. However, it does become a problem if you have researched worlds for years and just never written a single word. Eventually, you do have to write the book. So, discovering your archetype, you might be a scholar if you find yourself unable to start until you've done a ton of research. Ask yourself, do you feel more secure when you've built a solid knowledge foundation before you begin drafting? Do you enjoy world building or historical detail as much as you do telling the story itself? If you answer yes to any of these questions, you might be a scholar. The third archetype is, of course, another one that we hear about commonly, and that is the pantser. A pantser writes to discover the story. So you might also hear this as a discovery writer. They thrive on surprise and getting into flow and can often feel hindered by knowing too much about the story in advance. So if you have been trying to be a plotter, and then every time you plot, you're just like, well, the story's done in my head. I don't even find it interesting anymore. You might actually be a pantser. And we'll talk about this later in the video, but there are all types of hybrids with people that like to know a few things about the story, but not too much that they get into the weeds of it. And then there are some pantsers, like true pantsers, who just have a little bit of an idea of how a story starts, and they will just sit down and discover the story as they go. These writers are often writing very intuitively. They're following what they already intuitively understand about story structure. So it's not like pantsers aren't using story structure at all. It's just coming from a deep knowledge of how stories work and how your character will react as you're writing your story. So don't hold yourself back from trying or experimenting with being a pantser. The pros to being a pantser is that you often have this very fresh, authentic story that becomes full of energy and discovery. Another pro that I didn't add on to the slide sheet is just that sometimes pantsers, because you're not overthinking and getting stuck into perfectionism, pantsers write faster often, and they often publish faster as well because you've just got this draft that's flowing out of you, especially if you're really excited to tell the story and you allow yourself to just be in the moment. Sometimes pantsers are faster writers. A con, however, is that you have a risk of wandering off course. You have a lot of pantsers who have unfinished drafts, and when they get to the end, the plot can often be so tangled because you were discovering the story as you go. So whatever happened at the end has nothing to really do with what happened at the beginning. And so there comes a point when you've finished a draft and it's very tangled. And if you don't know enough about story structure, or you don't feel interested in the story anymore because you have technically finish the draft, it can often be a lot more difficult to go back and revise it if the story is tangled up in some way and you just aren't sure how to fix it. You might be a pantser if you answer yes to some of these questions. Do you lose interest if you over outline or plan too much? Do your best scenes appear in bursts of inspiration as you're writing, often surprising even you? You didn't even know that character existed. You didn't even know this argument was going to happen. You didn't even know the hero was going to open the door and find this in the closet. So often with people who are pantsers, the ideas come as you're writing, and that can surprise you, but lead you on fun adventures as you go. Do you write to discover what happens next rather than following a specific plan? This is often pantsers. Now, I am not a pantser. So if you find that you are one of these archetypes, I would love for you to identify which ones you are in the comments as we go on, and tell me, what did I miss here? What are some other pros that I didn't think about? What are some other things that trip you up that I didn't think about? Because I will read every one of your comments and maybe even create better videos on this in the future as we continue this conversation. So the fourth archetype here is the puzzler. A puzzler writes scenes out of order and assembles them later like a puzzle. A puzzler tends to follow inspiration rather than a linear timeline. So, this is one that I identify with very much. So, I have pieces of being a plotter. However, when I actually write, I don't write first scene, second scene, third scene. I will often write that midpoint scene or that argument or that first time the character meets somebody. And then I might write the last scene as well. And I write out of order and then piece it all together later, especially when I am writing multiple POVs. So in my main Shadow Demon saga, I have 4 major points of view character. And so I sometimes will write all of Harper's story, even out of order, but I'm focused on Harper. And then I will go and I will write Jackson's piece of the story where he's in a totally different location in this fantasy world. And then later, once I have all of those pieces, I will begin taking sticky notes and index cards and moving things around to create a flow. But that doesn't happen often until later when I have the story more completed. Some of the pros to being a puzzler is that it captures these inspired moments immediately. Rather than having to wait for that scene that you really love, you can just write it today. And so every day when you sit down or you're about to write, you can just think about, what's the scene I really want to write? It also helps to build really strong standout scenes because those are the ones that you write first, and then you write everything else to build to that moment rather than the other way around. However, the cons here of being a puzzler are that stitching it together later can be really overwhelming or disjointed. So you may end up rewriting entire sections when you get to your edits. This is definitely what often happens to me is I will write out of order and then something will happen and I'll realize, okay, this entire section that I wrote at the end doesn't work anymore, but it's still part of the process. And I think one of the things that I've been leaning into with my own process is understanding that no words are wasted. Even if I end up throwing them out in the long run, they were still part of the process when it comes to figuring out the real story. And so there's a bit of discovery in this as well, like there probably is with every type of writing process. And we'll talk about this at the end, but very few of us are just this one pure thing. Most of us are going to be hybrids of multiple different processes, but I definitely identify with puzzler. So ask yourself, do you often imagine climactic or vivid scenes first and then connect the dots later? Like, do you see that final climax, that final battle before you've even written the midpoint? Do you see these big heated moments or big set piece type moments in your story before you even know who the characters are? You might be a puzzler. Do you like to skip around and write whatever scene is inspiring you in the moment rather than the scene that happens next in the linear timeline? Does piecing the story together afterward feel exciting to you, or does it feel overwhelming? If it sounds exciting, you might be a puzzler. But if the idea of writing all your scenes out of order and then later trying to figure out how it all fits together just makes you break out in hives, you're probably not a puzzler. Archetype number 5 is the sculptor. The sculptor may draft a rough skeleton really quickly, but then layers in details over time. The sculptor also might do multiple passes, adding in action, emotion, and description later. So, this is something that I have known several people that do this, where they will write a really quick skeleton draft. So, you might have heard like, people talking about a zero draft where there's maybe just dialogue, a little bit of action, but there's not a lot of emotion. There's not a lot of world building yet. There's not a lot of description. It's just a very like action level or dialogue relationship level, super fast, rough draft. And then they'll do an editing pass where they say, okay, now I'm going to add in some of the dialogue tags and some of the description of the setting. And then they'll go back and do another pass where they say, I'm going to add in more of the emotion now and some of the interaction between characters. If you find yourself doing a very quick draft and then layering in some of the action and emotion and romance and things like that as you go, you might be a sculptor. Some of the pros of being a sculptor is that you build momentum really fast. You're getting through it. You're discovering the story as you go, or maybe plotting. It could be some kind of combination of whether you have an outline or not. But the key is that you're writing a very rough, quick draft. And there's low pressure on that draft because you already know that you're going to make it better. You expect as it comes out that it's going to be rough. And every pass thereafter becomes really exciting because you're building it in layers, much like a sculptor does when they're sculpting something. You may see the first few passes on stone. I can't even tell what this is going to be yet, but as that sculptor gets in and adds a new layer and a new layer and a new layer, you begin to see it take shape. And that's what happens with a sculptor who drafts this way. One of the biggest disadvantages to this type of writing is that you can often feel frustrated with really messy drafts or often still leave details underdeveloped. You might get stuck if you're unsure what happens next. So you need to write as quickly as possible, but you just aren't sure where the story is going to take you. And so you might end up not being able to write it as fast as possible and getting frustrated because you're stuck. So with the sculptor, it really needs to be a mindset of, I know this is going to be terrible. I know it's going to be really rough, and then I will layer things in later. However, with some sculptors, what happens is you have gone through so many passes, the story is done, and you just don't have excitement about adding in some of the details that will really make this book resonate and make it strong. So you might not have as much description and emotion as it really requires to make it interesting to the reader because you've already told the story and you just don't want to go through all those extra editing passes. So ask yourself this to see if you are a sculptor. Do you prefer to draft a rough skeleton of the story quickly, maybe only writing the dialogue first, for example? Do you think of writing as building a shape you refine with each new layer? Are you comfortable with messy drafts as long as you're making steady progress? Then you might be a sculptor. Now, the 6th archetype is the polisher. The polisher edits as they go, and they prefer clean, finished chapters before moving forward. Now, this is one of those archetypes where people will tell you you shouldn't do it this way. And that is absolutely not true. There is no point where you should listen to anyone who says you cannot do it this way or you shouldn't do it this way, because we are all different in our process. What you should do is always lean into what works for you. And so give yourself permission to explore this, but people will say, do not edit as you go. And that is just coming from their own experience. Because if you are a sculptor, for example, you don't want to edit as you go. You want to just write it as quickly as possible. But if you are a polisher, you are someone who desires to edit, who does best when you are allowed to edit as you go. So a polisher will write a chapter, go back, edit it, change the words, make sure all the typos are cleaned up, get in all that dialogue and make it feel resonant and almost just like wrapped up with a beautiful bow before they move on to the next chapter. And that is what feels comfortable for them. So what are the pros to this type of writing? The pro is that a polisher ends up with a near final draft when they're done. less heavy revision later because they've done the revision as they go along. So by the time a polisher gets to the end of a novel, they're pretty much done with the book. However, some of the cons here is that a polisher can stall on early chapters, getting into a loop of endless editing and never reaching the end. So if you have found yourself editing as you go and you have 10 books on your hard drive that have the first 3 chapters that are polished to perfection, but you never make it past the midpoint, you might be a polisher, but you might need to make sure that you have some kind of process for helping you continue on with the novel. Polishers also may feel frustrated if the story changes midway and then they have to go back and rewrite some of those early chapters that they've already spent so much time editing, and they have a hard time cutting what needs to be cut and rewritten because they already feel attached and they already loved those chapters, and it can be really hard to let them go. So, are you a polisher? Do you feel uncomfortable leaving typos, awkward sentences, or rough chapters behind? If it has always held you back because people have told you not to edit as you go, but you just feel like I cannot move on with the story until this is right, then you might want to experiment with being a polisher and editing as you go. Do you aim to have a clean, near final draft by the time you finish your first draft? Do you spend as much time editing a chapter as you do writing it? If you said yes to any of these, then you might be a polisher. Archetype number 7 is the binger. This is also me. The binger thinks for long stretches, then pours out massive word counts in bursts once the story feels ready. So, for example, I have been writing my latest book, A Mirror of Shadows, for pretty much 10 months, off and on, not working on it every week, but working on it pretty consistently. But a lot of my working on it has been in my notebook, thinking through the world, thinking through the characters, trying to figure out the right hook and premise, and writing, not liking it, but spending a lot of time thinking about it. And then I went away this past weekend and wrote 16,000 words in 2 days because I could feel the story ready to go. I have also had moments in the past where I have gone to a hotel for just one night and written 17,000 words. And this is something that I never felt comfortable talking about because a lot of people have judgment about this. And they'll say, there's no way you could possibly write 17,000 good words in a single night. And this is where I really challenge you to think about any judgments that you've had of yourself as you've been going through your process, as well as the judgments that you've had of other writers. Because for binge writers, the pro here is that you have high productivity during bursts and you are so deeply immersed in that story world for those 15, 16, 17 hours at a stretch that you have really tight cohesion between scenes. That emotion is on point. Like, one of the number one comments that I get from my readers is that I feel like I just was a part of that world and I could see it playing through like a movie and I could feel everything that your character was feeling. I personally think that one of the reasons my readers feel that way is because I often write in really long bursts, 12, 15-hour stretches at a time. And so I portal into that world, I immerse myself in it completely, and I don't come out of it for a long period of time. And that makes me a binge writer. However, there are some pretty gnarly consequences or cons to being a binger. The biggest one is burnout, but also long gaps where nothing gets done, which makes it harder to be consistent with deadlines because you're just waiting for that story to come together in your mind. And if it's not coming together, you really can't ever hit that moment where you're in a binge because you can't figure out what's happening in the story. For me, as a binge writer, first of all, it took me a long time to admit to it and to lean into it because everybody tells us you're supposed to write like every day at the same time in order to be a professional. You can't write for 12 hours at a time and then not write for 2 weeks. You're supposed to sit down every day and be consistent. And so sometimes it can be difficult to embrace your process instead of pushing against it because of what everyone tells you you should do. So that's been one problem. The other problem is, as a binger, I really need to have dedicated time where I am allowing myself to just think or talk through the story and not feel like I have to get word count. Because when I pressure myself to write faster, I am not actually giving myself the time I need to think through and figure it out before I'm actually writing. And so I will be working on continuing, just like you are, hopefully after this video, continuing to lean deeper into my process so that I can avoid some of the cons that go along with the type of writer that I naturally am. So are you also a binger? Do you think about your story for weeks or even months before even writing much of it at all? And then thrive on marathon sessions, 10K plus words at a time, all nighter sprints, all day immersion in your story. Do you feel most connected to your story when you can immerse deeply for long stretches of time? I know, like, one of my very best friends, she can write for maybe 2 hours at a time, and then she's just completely done. There would be no way that she could sit down for 12 or 15 hours and write at a stretch. And so this is, again, where I encourage you not to think that one type is better or one type is not as good, because it may sound great. Oh, I wish I could write for 12 hours focused at a time. But there are a lot of cons to it, like burnout and not writing as consistently. Whereas somebody who writes consistently for an hour every day may actually end up writing faster than someone who binge writes 17,000 words in a night, but takes them 3 or 4 months to sit down. So every single writer archetype, every process has its pros and cons. And the key is to figure out what's your process and then how do you amplify it and make it work for you instead of constantly resisting it or trying to be like somebody else. Okay, we are moving on. We have 2 left. Number 8 is the multitasker. The multitasker works on multiple projects at once, drafting one, editing another, outlining a third, and they need variety to stay engaged. The pro to this, of course, is that creativity is always flowing. There's no boredom, there's flexible productivity because you've got lots of projects going at once. Maybe you have 3 different stories in draft, maybe you're writing multiple different genres. And so when you sit down to write, you can choose the project that is most exciting to you at this point. And then if you have a project that you feel stuck in, you can assign that to your subconscious mind. Think about it later, but keep moving forward today with the story that has energy and aliveness to you. The major con to this, however, is that you can spread your energy too thin and leave a lot of projects unfinished. When you're constantly chasing the excitement of a project, sometimes it can be easy and all too tempting to just abandon that project for a brand new one that has more excitement to it. So you can end up with a lot of unfinished drafts because nothing feels that exciting. It also may take a long time to finish a single project or series because you have so many different ones going at once. However, this is another process where people will tell you you shouldn't do this. You should see this one all the way through. You should finish it. But the truth is that some writers need that variety, especially writers that have ADHD. Sometimes you just need a couple projects going on at once so that if this one gets stuck, you can go in and polish and edit this other one. So you have lots of things on the go and something always feels exciting. But if you have found yourself in this situation where you're just always getting stuck and you're starting over, then you might still be a multitasker, but you will need to put some kind of guardrails and motivation in so that you do eventually get things done. You might be a multitasker if you answer yes to these questions. Do you feel restless or uninspired if you're only working on one project at a time? Do you like switching between genres, stories, or formats depending on your mood? And do you often make progress across multiple drafts simultaneously instead of linearly? Our final type, of course, is the one that most of us will be in combination with some of the others that I've talked about today, and that is the hybrid. So sometimes you will hear this called a plantser, or my friend Ines sometimes calls this a panty liner. When people will talk about if you're a pantser and a plotter, like somebody who maybe knows a bit of the plot, has a good solid outline, but then still will have moments of inspiration where they're still discovering the story as they go. And the truth is, most of us are somewhere in that in between place. And so when we think about the hybrid author, it's not just a hybrid between a pantser and a plotter, but it could be a hybrid of any of these things. So, like I mentioned before, I'm definitely a binger, but I'm also a plotter. And I am definitely also a puzzler. And so all 3 of those become a piece of my writing process. And as I begin to discover how those can work for me, as well as all the places where I can get stuck in each of those 3 parts of my process, then I can continue to refine it and hopefully begin to write faster and write more joyfully instead of constantly beating myself up. So, a hybrid is some combination of any 2 or more of these archetypes that we've mentioned today, and they may adapt their process depending on the project. So, just to go back to my own story, when I was writing contemporary romances in my Fair Hope series, and when I was writing romances for Willow Harbor, I actually didn't do as much puzzling. I wrote those stories more linearly. I think because it was a romance and not a fantasy where you have a lot of world building and a lot of action or battle scenes. Like Fair Hope had no battle scenes unless you want to count an argument between two of my romance characters. So I wrote those more linearly. I didn't really lean as much on the puzzling side of it. However, those I heavily binge wrote because I found that that consistency in the relationship and carrying that emotion through was so much more powerful when I could write in 15-hour segments of time. So you may adapt your process depending on what you're writing. The pros to being a hybrid is you're flexible, it's resilient, and it uses the best of all worlds. The hybrid author has created a process unique and customized to their personal strengths and desires, which is why I say that this is really at its core what most of us are, is some hybrid of all of these other types. And so maybe there's a type that you haven't really tried or identified as yet that you heard about today that you think, I'm going to try that. And so give yourself permission to play around with it because it does take most of us some time to figure out our ideal writing process. And chances are you're some type of hybrid. The cons to being a hybrid is that hybrids can often struggle with indecision or lack of consistency because you're trying to fit yourself into this one very strict, like, I have to be a plotter. But maybe you're someone who should start out as a pantser and then plot when you get stuck, right? Maybe you're somebody who needs to do that skeleton draft until you get stuck and then lean on more of a polisher and go back and do that second layer for the first half of your book. I think sometimes hybrid can also have problems reinventing themselves with each new book. And so a lot of times if you are a hybrid of these different types, you might not allow yourself to try something new with this new book. And so this is where I think it's important as an author to really lean into your intuition and lean into how you're feeling as you draft, because you might be just anxious to write that last scene of the book, but think, oh, I can't do that yet because that's not what you do. But you might actually, for this project, be a puzzler who needs to write these stories out of order, these scenes out of order, and then go stitch them together. It might not work with every book, but it might work for this particular project. So discovering your archetype, ask yourself these questions. Do you like to know the major beats, but also leave room for detours? Do you mix strategies, sometimes plotting, sometimes pantsing, depending on the project? Do you pull from multiple archetypes rather than sticking to just one? Those are the 9 archetypes. And again, if you head down below, I've got the Canva slides that I use to make this down there. So you can go back through these because I know it's been a lot. Plus, there's a workbook that I created for you that's going to have some reflection questions. And as you work through them, maybe you can circle or highlight the one that you think is most relevant to you. Hopefully, as you answer those questions, as you work through some of that journaling in the workbook, or just as you listen to this video today, you've already had some aha moments about, oh my gosh, that's what I do when I'm not judging myself or when I'm not trying to fit myself into someone else's writing process. Your process may be extremely unique to you. Like, I have a friend who writes cozy mysteries and she has already an established world, but what she will often do is she will write and pants it until she hits a point where she's like, okay, now I know I need to plot. And then she will take a couple of weeks or even a few days sometimes to sit and figure out what's the plot and the trajectory of the rest of the book. So she's very hybrid because she's a pantser and then she becomes a plotter. I, for example, am somebody who is definitely structured. I'm a plotter. I like to have a lot of the scenes figured out, and sometimes we'll have very detailed note cards about what I'm writing. But as I get started, I will also have those discovery writer moments where it will be like, I didn't expect that character. I didn't know that witch was going to do that. I didn't know this new person was going to come in and drop this bomb in the middle of chapter 2. And so I have to pivot, and all of those scene cards that I might have created might now be needing to be adjusted. Also, there are times when I write linearly and I will sit down and I will get 3,000 words a day consistently for a week. But there are also times where I will sit down for a night at a hotel and I will write 17,000 words and they might be completely out of order and I have to reorder them later. I almost never edit as I go. That is not usually something that I do. So hopefully when you look at this list, you can say that is definitely not me, or yes, I use a little bit of this, a little bit of this, and kind of mix together, since it's Halloween season, mix together your own potion, your own sort of writing spell in terms of how you like to write. It can be your own mix and make it as unique as possible to you. So I know this video has been a little bit long, but I feel that this is not something that we talk about enough. And of course, there might be something completely different that I didn't even think of or mention today. So I want to hear your feedback in the comments if there's something that you do that you lean into that I didn't even talk about or cover here today. But before we go, I am going to leave you with 5 tips of how to deal with whatever it is you've been struggling with your writing process. So tip number 1 is to work with your energy and not against it. If you're a binger, plan those nights when you can do nothing but write. Be ready for when you feel that you're ready for a binge, that you can just drop everything off your schedule, but also plan for those recovery days so that you do not burn out. If you're a polisher, maybe set some limits on how long you're allowed to spend editing a chapter before you move on to the next chapter, or have some kind of process in place to know when you're done fiddling with it and you're just making it different and not better. If you're a plotter, try to figure out when it feels right to stop putting down the details and start writing. Don't delay the writing just because you feel like you need to have it all figured out. Tip number 2, build in guardrails to prevent common hangups. So once you start to identify which process is yours, you can also begin to identify, where do I constantly keep getting stuck? If you're a plotter, maybe you need to set some deadlines on how long you're allowed to plot and when you need to start writing. Scholars might need research caps. You might need, this is the most amount of research I'm allowed to do. Now I have identified that I've gone into things that I don't actually need for my novel. Maybe you make a bulleted list of the things you need to know, and you don't allow yourself to continue to research beyond that unless you've hit your word count for the day. Pantsers might need a mid-draft check-in or somebody that they're talking to that understands story structure that can help keep them on track. But wherever you are consistently getting hung up, put some guardrails around that and give yourself some systems to help keep moving forward. Tip number 3 is to use your type to build consistent routines and support. If you're a plotter or a scholar, go ahead and build in the time to plot and think, and don't feel pressure about having to get writing every single day. However, maybe give yourself a deadline and say, by December 1st, I will be drafting now. So you're building in some routines and systems to help you keep moving forward. If you're a pantser or a puzzler, protect that excitement, discovery energy of, oh, I'm going to really tap into what is exciting me today. Maybe you even create a ritual when you sit down of journaling or going into some visualization to think, what am I most excited about writing today? However, make sure that you have some kind of check-ins to make sure you don't just keep going off the rails, that you do have a way to bring yourself back to that story structure and editing. If you're a sculptor or you're a polisher, which are kind of like 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, balance that forward momentum with some quality checks along the way. If you're a binger or a multitasker, build calendars that have flexibility into it instead of giving yourself absolute deadlines where you say, okay, I'm a binger, but I got to have this book done in the next 2 weeks. You might need more time to think than that. If you're a multitasker, you might need more flexibility in your schedule because you're working on 3 projects at once. So go ahead and set yourself up for that ahead of time. If you're a hybrid, then experiment freely. Play around with all of these different processes and try to figure out the ones that most resonate with you and the ones that you can just eliminate and never feel any guilt over again, because it's just not who you are as a writer. Tip number 4 is to allow your process to evolve over time. We don't usually just write one book. Yes, that is what we do as professional writers. We are always working on the next book. However, every single book does not require the same process. Some works require more research than others. Some things are just going to flow out of us in surprise. Some are going to require some changes to our process because the genre is a little different. Like Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw was my first YA thriller, and it had multiple points of view, more than 8 points of view. And it was multiple timelines, very complex mystery in terms of what my head was seeing. And I needed to adjust my process for that. And it took me a little bit of time to adjust into that, but I learned so much and I grew so much as an author. Allow yourself to be flexible, and what worked for you before you had kids might not work now, or what worked for you when you were a writer in college might not work for you now. So be willing to adapt your process as you go. And tip number 5, of course, in true heart breathing style is to stay true to yourself instead of trying to be like anyone else. I know that so often in the writer world, like I said at the beginning, we feel like this is it. We gotta follow and be plotters. Everybody has to be a plotter. And you maybe even have felt that way watching some of my videos because you see very clear examples of how I do things. But this is my stance here right now to say it doesn't have to be done the way that I do it. It doesn't have to be done the way the books tell you to do it. Your writing process is going to be completely unique and customized to you. And the more you can give yourself permission to just do it the way that you do it, the better off you're going to be. The more joyful you'll be as a writer, the faster you'll write, the more optimized your system will be. And so if you don't know yet, because you're still an early writer, how your process is going to look, take this list and experiment with it. Take a short story, take a small scene, and see if you try it on a note card. Does it work this way if you had it already plotted out in advance, or does that feel too restrictive to you? What if you have no idea what you're going to write except just a very snippet of dialogue? Can you sit down and pants that? Try a skeleton draft of a scene and don't even put in dialogue tags or a lot of action. Can you do that? Does that feel natural to you? Does that feel exciting? And then to go back later, try writing a scene and then going back and editing it a couple of times and seeing if that feels good to you. The best thing that you can do for your future as a writer is to experiment with these different writing processes and really lean into the one that most resonates and helps you as a writer. In the end, there are infinite paths to go from idea to the best novel that you can write, and it doesn't have to look like anyone else's path. So drop it in the comments. Which archetype are you, or are you something completely different than what we talked about? Most of us are going to be hybrid. So if you think you're a hybrid, drop in the comments which ones you think you resonate most with and blend together. And don't forget that we have an entire Preptober planner and workbook that you can get access to for free, as well as a new quick workbook that just has some of these journaling questions for you, as well as the Canvas slides from today if you want to take a closer look at these. I loved talking about this. If you want to see more videos on writing process, please let me know. But for now, we have lots of great Preptober videos coming up, even including things I wish I had known when I first started writing, how to come up with great ideas and actually start writing your first chapter, how to avoid amateur writing mistakes, and more. So if you are not subscribed, we would love to have you in the Heart Breathings family. There's lots of great videos coming up as we approach the Rough Draft Challenge in November. And you can officially now create your November project in the Rough Draft Challenge website, and I will link that for you down below. It's just roughdraftchallenge.com. It's a really minimal, easy to use website. And I will also link a video that shows you how to set up your project if you'd like to do that now. All right, you guys, check out the Preptober playlist. I super love you. I am cheering you on as you discover your writing process and really give yourself permission to lean into it. And I will see you in my next one. Bye.